engineers coming off the pipeline in particular. So they've started to look at how they best utilise the skills they have. I think national oil companies are slightly behind, but it's not actually a big differential. In terms of oil and gas, I think the second point I would particularly draw out, given that the people are really going to be delivering the strategy, there isn't really a great understanding of how the workforce is best utilised and how it's best meeting that demand and supply and getting people into the right place. Particularly if you look forward over the 5-10 year window, probably quite good in the here and now. If I look at Fawley when I was at the refinery, very good from the refining kind of workforce, understanding where they needed to be in the next 6 to 12 months. So when we were there, we had a big turnaround, which occurs every 7 to 10 years. And there was a huge project and an absolute thirst to understand they're going to bring about 1,500 contractors onto site and double the contractor workforce. And there was a real understanding of how that operation needed to happen. We moved people from existing roles within the refinery population into specific project roles to deliver that, and a real workforce planning understanding of how to deliver that specific project. If you then said, well, what happens after the project, there was less clarity, because the absolute priority there and then on the refinery was around that turnaround. So I think you see a real kind of understanding of the short-term need in the operational side of things, maybe slightly less in terms of the longer-term planning. One of the key parts to get into this, I've talked about looking at an organisation and you start thinking about 17,000 people. That's a heck of a lot of people to try and plan for. You can break that down probably thinking about the different groups, the different companies, different organisations within that 17,000. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to look at the different locations and do it geographically. But as we've talked about, it's actually becoming more of a global market in terms of the oil sector. So looking at it in a different way, we like to split up the workforce into different skill sections. So simply broken down into 4 sort of talent groups. On the top left, specialists, where they are quite a difficult skill to replace. Probably gone through a certain level of education and not necessarily a huge resource pool that's actually being able to tap into. However, they're not necessarily the highest value people in terms of their impact on the supply chain, on the value chain. If I was looking at this, I would say something like an oil trader. It's a specific skill set. It's kind of important to the organisation, but actually its kind of worth on the value chain probably isn't at that top end. In the top end, you get towards the critical workforce. And I think if you did this analysis within oil, you'd probably say upstream has more people in this sector than downstream. There are some absolutely crucial roles that provide the real value to the organisation, and added to that are exceptionally difficult to replace. Coming down towards the bottom right, you then have your core workforce, the people that really just turn the organisation over. An availability of skill set, but a real value add to the organisation. And then finally, in the bottom left, you have your flexible workforce, probably a lower skilled, a readily available resource. Now, what I would say within our experience of the oil sector in doing this is, again, it tends to be done in an isolated case, normally brought about by a lack of resource. So when we're looking at an expansion, we don't have this particular thing, so we move it all into the top right-hand corner. Suddenly, everybody in the organisation is a critical workforce. Actually, a good organisation will have fewer people there because that is the skill set that's most difficult to replace. Okay, it's adding high value, but that's only in a relative assessment to everyone else. So the trick for an organisation is not to have, it's almost a single point failure of not getting too many people into that critical workforce section. It should be quite short term as well. It's possible to move from one section to another. We were talking about this yesterday and saying that if you looked at the renewable energy part of the oil sector, BP probably 10, 15 years ago put a real emphasis on the renewable energy side of things, and they brought in a lot of specialists, and they probably put that in the top right-hand corner. They used the slogan of better petroleum. They wanted to live that kind of renewable energy. That was going to be their brand. So they had their renewable workforce in that top right-hand corner. They were absolutely critical. If they didn't deliver that, then they weren't really living the value that they were trying to sell to the world. If you looked at Exxon, they probably had them in the left-hand side, as close to the adding no value as possible, because Exxon weren't really buying into that. They had a relationship with Stanford University where they could say, we're doing things on that, but they weren't really living the value of the renewable energy. Now, if you look at Exxon, they've probably moved their renewable energy resources into the critical workforce section. They've put a big advertising campaign out over the last 12 to 24 months about how they're getting into this space, how they're moving away from the oil reliance. They've just bought an organisation for $30 billion around moving away from the oil sector, and that's towards using gas differently. So it's absolutely possible, depending on your strategy, to move people around this segmenting. Why would this be useful for KPC in the group? I think if you look at your specialists and your critical workforce, there is probably a lack of supply around this area. And I would contend that actually this is the area that maybe you should be looking at the global resource market. This is where you should be thinking about actually how do we go out and attract people to our organisation in these particular skills in the short term. In the longer term, there's a challenge that says, how do you influence the Q80 resource pool to get people into this group in future years? What tie-ups do you do with universities? How do you affect the education? How do you make the oil industry more appealing to get people to want to be in this section? The short-term solution is absolutely to go out and buy it potentially from the global market, but longer term, how do you make that pipeline available within the Q80 sector? Secondly, the bottom piece, around the flexible workforce, the core workforce. These are the sorts of roles that you should be thinking about using your nationalisation targets. How do you get the majority of these roles being of Q80 national, rather than potentially buying in contractors or using your global resource pool on those that aren't the skills that are most difficult to replace? So if you did an analysis of your organisation, how many of your global resource pool would you have at the top versus the nationals at the bottom? And then looking at that and saying, well, how does that affect our recruitment campaigns? How does that affect our demand and supply going forward for our workforce? In terms of a workforce planning approach, what I didn't want to do was kind of put up a typical consultant 5-chevron model and say this is how you do workforce planning. Because absolutely it has to be tailored to your organisation. There will be different ways of doing it, and within the group there will be different ways of doing it. But what I would say is there is an overall approach that if you follow in its kind of practical steps, it will enable you as an organisation to better manage your demand and supply of your workforce. So, what we would recommend is you identify your critical workforce segments. Actually go through that process that says, within this organisation, this is the talent pool that we have. This is where they fit within our segmentation. And I challenge you, absolutely, the first time you go out, everybody will be critical workforce. Because it's kind of that, you have that conversation with people, and they don't want to be kind of lower down the value chain. It's quite a difficult conversation to have. They're a very valuable member of staff. They're absolutely enabling the organisation to succeed. But are they truly critical? Probably not. All of the back office, I hate to say it, but HR aren't critical.